This week we're going to be taking a look at the fifth commandment. And in this commandment, God sets out rules that defend and protect one of his most precious and important gifts to us, human life. You shall not murder. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but help and support him in every physical need. Now, on the face of it, you probably are thinking that this commandment doesn't really need that much explanation because it's pretty clear. You shall not murder means you shall not murder. But actually, this command, as the scriptures show us, goes a lot further than simply saying don't strangle someone when you're angry with them. In fact, the basic heart of this commandment is that God is the giver of life, that it's his gift to us. He is the one who authors it, and he is the only one who has the right to take it away. So what specifically is God commanding us to do in the fifth commandment? Well, before we answer that, let's look at a word that popped up in the explanation, the word neighbor. See, when we use the word neighbor, we usually mean the person who lives right next to us or people who live right down the street. But when the Bible uses the word neighbor, it means not just the people who live next to you, but literally everyone who is put into your life, because in God's thinking, you have an obligation to everyone who is in your life. They are your neighbor. So when the commandment says to help and support our neighbor in every bodily need, it means help and support everyone in your life in every bodily need. And notice that the emphasis there is on helping and supporting their bodily in any bodily need they might have, so that when we see a need that supports their life and their physical well-being, we should be willing to do whatever we're able to do within the limits of what we're able to do, to take the time, the energy, and the resources to help them and support them. So if we see our neighbor is hungry or thirsty or needs clothes or exposed to some bad weather and needs some shelter, we should take whatever steps we can to make sure those needs get met. This goes hand in hand with protecting and promoting human life. Remember, the center of this commandment is that God has given us life as a gift, and he wants us to respect it, to honor it, to treat it well. And so we should, on the one hand, protect human life. That means defend it from anything that might hurt it or harm it or end it. So not only feed them if they have a need, but even if we see, say, somebody in school in danger, maybe they're surrounded by bullies who are getting ready to beat them up or do something bad to them. What God is commanding here is that to the extent that we're able, we step in to do what we can to see our neighbor safely through the situation. But not only are we to protect them, to defend them from needs or dangers, we're also supposed to promote their life, doing whatever we can to give them the resources and the conditions they need to live the fully human life God intends for them. So if that's what God commands, for us to treat and life with respect and to respect and protect other people's lives, what is he forbidding in this commandment? Well, pretty much anything that goes against what we just talked about. That includes hurting or harming my neighbor in his body. See, everybody could probably look at this commandment and know that God is saying, don't actually take or end someone's life. But beyond simply taking or ending human life, God is also forbidding that we do anything that might damage or hurt the life and physical well-being of my neighbor. That includes hitting, biting, kicking, violence of any kind on someone else. It includes even things like hating or resenting or holding on to anger toward someone else. See, even though anger or hatred may not actively end someone else's life, and it might not even cause them any physical harm, hatred and anger and resentment comes from a complete failure to appreciate the life, the worth, the dignity that God has given that other person. It's looking at the life and that other person as a problem, rather than as somebody who is worthy of my respect and my support. And so Jesus even very clearly forbids in the Gospel of Matthew anger towards anyone as on the same level in God's sight as murdering him, because it shows the same level of fear and love and trust in God and the same level of love and concern for our neighbor as hurting them or harming them. So, while that seems pretty straightforward, I bet if you sat down and thought about things in the news or certain cases in life, you might wonder how God's commandment applies to those, whether certain kinds of actions that people get up to, like for instance war or abortion, technically count as murder or are against God's law. So let's talk about some of these, and we can certainly talk more about them in class when the time comes. But let's start with abortion. Abortion, in case you aren't aware, is ending the pregnancy of a woman by ending the life of the child in her womb. The way that God speaks in the scripture clearly indicates that from the moment of conception, from the moment a pregnancy begins, there is a human life in that woman's womb. That it is not just a collection of cells that isn't really a human or really alive. It is fully and completely human, given life by God and loved and valued by him as a human creature. And so abortion is a very straightforward act of killing the child in the womb. The only difference between abortion and murdering a small child is where that child happens to be. One is outside in the world around us, the other is in its mother's womb. Both would be murder. Euthanasia and assisted suicide is another way that people have lately especially been breaking the fifth commandment. Euthanasia simply means that a doctor would give someone poison, or either by injection or by a pill, or do some other steps to end the life of a patient in order to treat their disease. So for instance, let's say I have skin cancer and it got really bad, I didn't treat it in time, and it spread to my whole body, and now I only have a few months to live, and frankly, I'm in a lot of pain. So I go to my doctor and I ask him to end my suffering by ending my life. That would be euthanasia. And that would also be treating my life as something that is in my hands, as something that I can terminate actively in order to avoid the suffering, the pain that I'm feeling. Euthanasia would be against the law of God here, because it would terminate the life of the person actively. Assisted suicide is very similar to euthanasia, except instead of the doctor being the one who does the killing, the doctor simply gives the patient tools like medicine or something that the patient can then use to end his or her own life. In the same way as euthanasia, using death as a treatment, even though we might have what we think are very good motivations to prevent suffering, to prevent pain, still ends up denying God's gift of life to that person and putting our own comfort over and above God's gift and will for our life. Suicide is up in that same alley, for the fifth commandment doesn't simply forbid us from taking the lives of other people. It also forbids us from taking the life of ourselves. My life is not really my life. My life is still God's gift, and God is the only one who has the right to take it away. Capital punishment is a little more tricky of an issue. Now, I will say, before we go any further, that all of the previous ones, especially when we get to issues like euthanasia and assisted suicide, even though I've said this as though it's a pretty simple matter of, yes, that's always murder, technology has made it a lot more complicated than that, and we can talk about that in class in more detail. But capital punishment is also a very complicated one because while it looks very straightforwardly like murder, we have to remember one basic truth. God is the one who gives life. God is the one who has the authority to take it away. And no one, not a single person, not a police officer, not a government official, no one should take another person's life into their own hands unless God himself gives someone the authority to take a life. As the one who can end life, God can also call people to serve him by being the tool he uses to end the life of another person. Again, we'll talk more about this in class, but a good summary is that the government technically does have the authority from God to, in some cases, sometimes, take the life of people. And it would not be against the fifth commandment because God himself has given them the authority. The same kind of idea applies with war, where obviously a lot of people die and kill in war. And again, war is a complicated thing because I certainly don't want to give you the impression that every act of capital punishment is good or executing a prisoner, and certainly not every war or everything that happens during a war is okay by the fifth commandment. But it is true that, again, God does give government a certain amount of authority to carry out war under very specific kinds of conditions. Nevertheless, there is almost always, in fact, there always is some kind of sin against the fifth commandment in a war. It's never a good thing. There's always evil that happens during it. But in theory, God does allow governments in certain times, places, and conditions to enact a war. Again, we'll talk about these more in class, but it should be giving you the sense that even though the commandment sounds pretty straightforward, there's a lot of very complex things in our lives that make it very difficult to know how we would or should follow God's will in this matter.